The Parsha of Vayikra, the beginning of the middle book of the 5 books of Moses. Vayikra focuses on the responsibilities of the community to bring gifts to God, physical offerings, which is how in a former time people in all places related to the source of mystery. For the Jewish people as well, upon leaving Egypt. Remember, in Egypt, Moses would say to Pharaoh, "Let my people go, that we might go worship God in the wilderness." And what was implied is that they would go to bring offerings, to bring gifts to God. Now, the people are taught in the Torah how they are to worship God. And details abound. Indeed, one of the things that's revolutionary in our Torah is that the service of the Kohanim, the service of the priests and the role of the Levites, those from the tribe of Levi that would support the service of the tabernacle and later the temple, what their responsibilities were are presented for all to see. In Egypt, the role of the priest was esoteric. It was a secret. The priest had power, particularly in the time and place of Egypt. The role of the priest was to be an enabler of reaching the world to come. Hence those magnificent pyramids in Egypt, symbols of the burial of people of power, particularly pharaohs, and the role of the priests, which would be to use esoteric knowledge in order to give a person a life in the world to come. In contrast, in our description of Vayikra, when a person died, the priest was not to have contact with a corpse. Only an exception was made for those of the immediate family of the priest, and more. As we begin our reading of Vayikra, when an offering was offered to God, and these in the first chapters are descriptions of the offerings of the public, there were no words recited. The priest was silent. Silent so as to emphasize there are no incantations. There is no abracadabra. There is no secret knowledge. Rather, these are gifts to God, expressions of the heart. Avodat belev, service of the heart. The word avodah will mean both the bringing of offerings, but later be understood as prayer. There are many details, so that in the study of Vayikra, one can get a fairly good sense of what it was that the different kinds of offerings represented, who brought them, how they were presented. Of course, like everything in the Torah, there is also the need for filling in more of the realia, the details of how things were actually practically completed, and our Talmud, our discussions between the rabbis will have many of those additional details. Mind you, the Talmud and the Mishnah were composed of conversations between the rabbis, and in the earliest layer of those conversations, it was during the time of the Second Temple, which would only be destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era. Those rabbis began conversations about the time the Romans came to Israel almost 100 years before. And so details matter. I asked that you consider before the Amidah, what's something you love, and how do details factor in? I remember in my youth having a particular love of baseball. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, the only professional teams we had at that time when I was growing up was spring training for baseball. So the San Francisco Giants, the Chicago Cubs, and so many more teams would come this time of year to Phoenix to prepare for the baseball season. And that would give my brother and me the opportunity to go to watch. We were particularly San Francisco Giant fans, and their field was in Tempe, Arizona, not that far from where we lived, which is also where Arizona State University is located, which gave us the opportunity to get autographs from Willie Mays and Juan Marichal, Willie McCovey, and so many of those players who were our heroes throughout the year. And being a baseball fan meant knowing the stats, knowing the RBIs, the run bat averages, the home runs for a season, the earned run averages of the pitchers, and we were mathematicians, or my brother more so, in terms of knowing, to the 100th to 1,000th decimal point what somebody's ERA was. Details mattered. And when, frankly, my parents were immigrants, so they never really understood baseball at all or understood an interest in baseball. And when they would say, it's just a game, what are you getting so excited about? It would be like, what do you mean it's just a game? This is baseball. We love our baseball. And when you're involved as a fan, by the way, fan is short for fanatic, when you are immersed in a sport, it becomes joyful. It becomes engaging, precisely because details matter. And nuances of a game could be remembered months and even years later. Who was on base in the 7th inning when the home run was hit would be remembered years afterwards. Details matter. And so for Vayikra, there are details because sacrifices mattered. They weren't just symbols. Symbols is something you describe at arm's length. Rather, they were vehicles, vessels for the heart engagement with God. And so when you brought, as described in the opening of Vayikra, an olah offering, an offering that would be placed on the altar and the smoke would rise toward heaven, there was a sense of bonding, of connecting, of expressing our deepest feelings toward the source of greatest power, the source of mystery, toward God. Which leads to Passover. It is the most beloved of holidays, judged by how people first, in percentages, attend Seder. So statistically, the most observed Jewish holiday in America is Passover. People who do not necessarily go to the synagogue will at Passover time hope to be with friends. Passover as a celebration has, going forward in regard to Seder night, a dinner party. And everybody likes a dinner party. But it's more than just the anticipation of great food and good company. It's the sense that when you gather together at a Seder, a week from tonight, for the first Seder this year, You are linking yourself across generations of belonging. And when we tell the story of the going out from Egypt, story of 3,000 plus years ago, the Haggadah, the telling, the text that we use will say, B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lerot et atzmo. In each generation, a person is to see him or herself, ki'ilu, as if, circle the as if, ki'ilu sheyatsa me'eretz Mitzrayim, as if you too went out from the land of Egypt. For Seder at its best is an engagement of imagination and collective memory that we indeed are recreating, reliving, re-experiencing both slavery, freedom, and more. The looking forward to the promised land and that journey of redemption. And so, as we prepare for Passover, with this week in front of us, our attention traditionally will turn to getting rid of those leavened products and replacing that with kosher LaPesach, that which is permitted on Passover. In the simplest form, that's getting rid of pasta and bread and substituting matzah. So here's an example of a detail. Next Saturday night is Passover. Friday night, of course, is a time identified with the smell of baking challah as we gather around our Shabbos table. Question: should you have next Friday night challah as part of your Shabbat celebration? This is one of those topics not discussed in the Torah. The Torah will describe in chapter 12 of Exodus the first Seder in Egypt. We'll read that next Saturday as part of our preparation. And so that describes the Seder in Egypt on the eve of the departure, in which in Egypt they were told, before you leave, you must gather on the 10th of the month, 4 days before the departure, a lamb. You have to roast it. You have to eat it all before the morning, which means invite over guests. And at that meal, also eat bitter herbs. And the rabbis will say, well, why bitter herbs? I mean, this is a meal of celebration. Bitter herbs are to remind us of slavery. The rabbis will comment that in the Seder, that evening before the departure, people needed a second reminder of why they're leaving. And so bitter herbs were at that first Seder. They are at our ongoing celebration of that evening, that departure, and the Exodus. Well, back to Friday night, not discussed in the Torah. What if, as Seder comes at the end of Shabbat, the rabbis will say that all the leavened products need to be out of the house the morning before the Seder. That would mean that next Saturday morning we would be cleaning our houses to make sure that all the chametz was out of the house. But it's Shabbat, and you're not supposed to be doing work on Shabbat. So that's the conundrum. That's the detail. If it is the day of the morning of the Seder that you're supposed to finalize, including the burning of the chametz, you burn your chametz, you traditionally, symbolically, and again, this is not in the Torah, but Judaism is not just the Torah, it's how the rabbis also understand the living out of the commandments of Torah. So the ritual is that the morning before the Seder, you burn your chametz. But next Saturday, you're not supposed to light fire on Shabbat. You're not supposed to burn stuff on Shabbat. And so that's, again, the conundrum. And so here's how the rabbis play it out. The way it gets played out is you look for the chametz, bidikat chametz, this ceremony that gets developed as recreating an older time, looking with a candle and a feather to find chametz hidden around the house. You do that on Thursday night, and you burn bi'ur chametz, the chametz, on Friday morning. That symbolically is the ritual of saying, we're done with chametz. And so there is a gray area of what is permitted on Pesach, but is not technically Pesach food. And there, in the conservative movement and what are debates, the decision is that egg matzah is not technically the fulfilling of the law of matzah. So come the Seder, when you're supposed to eat the crunchy matzah to remind you of lechem oni, the bread of affliction, that cannot be at the Seder. It's not that it's forbidden, but it's not the matzah of the slaves. The enriched matzah, enriched with eggs, which make it softer and more palatable, more easy to chew, that is permitted. There is no leavened product in it. It is technically wheat, and therefore it's the motzi, but it's not technically matzah either. And so, for next Friday night, for Shabbat, the detail, rather than making motzi over two chalot, traditionally, two breads that remind us by being two of the manna of the desert, a double portion, one would put out 2 egg matzahs and make motzi, because it is wheat, over that, but it's not yet the matzah of the Seder, which also some say with the beginning of the month of Nisan, which we're currently in, you're not supposed to be eating matzah either. That's back to this piece of teaching, a piece of Jewish law. So you might say, well, why not just 2 pieces of matzah next Friday night? And that brings in this other variable. And that is for the Seder on Saturday night to feel anticipated, to feel special. The rabbi said 2 weeks before Pesach, don't eat any matzah. So when you take that first bite of the unleavened bread, of the matzah at the Seder, there's a quality of surprise, of freshness, of experiencing the bread of affliction. So you can see on this one little question that's relevant for this unusual timing of the Seder being on a Saturday night, there's a detail. What do you say the motzi on Friday night? Once again, to pull this together, our Torah reading of Vayikra provides exoterically, publicly, all the details of how the priest is to bring an offering on behalf of community, behalf of individuals, on behalf of the priest as well. There is no hidden knowledge. And what knowledge is provided, the rabbis who are seeking to live out the laws of Torah will say there's many, many more details that are worthy of our conversation. Not as a game, but as something that informs how we live our lives in relationship with God. And of all the celebrations, the 3 pilgrimage holidays, Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot, the holiday that we as a community most engaged with both in ancient times and today is Passover. In preparing for this morning, I opened up Encyclopedia Judaica to read about Passover because I wanted to read about sacrifices. And there, Josephus, the great Roman Jewish historian, would claim that as many as 2 million people, in his second book of the history of the Jews, the War of the Jews, he would say 2 million people came to Jerusalem for Passover in the first century. And in the Talmud, there'll be one of the kings who claims that in his day, they would count the kidneys to determine how many people came to bring a lamb for their Passover barbecues. And he would say there were more, based on that count, people in Jerusalem that stood at Mount Sinai. Which is only to say, Passover was the most celebrated pilgrimage holiday. It's still, even in our day, the most celebrated Jewish event of the year. And the more one is engaged in the details, which traditionally are many, the more one is immersed in creating an experience of elevation, of liberation, going from the place that is Mitzrayim, the narrow constraints, to possibilities. And the greatest of those possibilities, and the punchline of our Seder, when we open the door after the meal for Elijah to enter, is the possibility that in the telling of this story, that is our story, that God enabled freedom, that God will guide and inspire and partner in creating a world marked by Elijah's announcement of harmony and wholeness. Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, what we love, we engage in with fullness of attention. And that means awareness that the details are where we find the joy. As we in this next week prepare for the Seders, as we remove chametz, those leavened products, clean our homes, prepare for our Seder celebration, may we find in the preparation joy. Hard to say. There's an element of the labor that some even experience as the slavery before freedom, with all the work of preparation. That's only natural to see at times. The details is tedious. But may we also know that in the attention to details, that is where we experience the holy. May we find a wow as we gather with families next Shabbat, expecting Seder. And at our Seders, may we find joy. And together we say, Amen.
Amen.